For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, with the latest readout video from our free Wednesday Wake Up newsletter, a reminder to subscribe to it if you haven't already, and a reminder from our new dog, Maze the Destroyer, to keep the contributions coming, including giving that YouTube thanks button a try, because she's getting through a lot of chew toys as well as a lot of kibble. And I also bring greetings to viewers in Melbourne, which is number 3 on our new and improved all-time views by city list, and, plot spoiler, is part of an Australian sweep of the podium. And those are followed by a sneer at progressives, who seem to have decided that on climate, as far more broadly, the ideal place to make a stand and rally the public against Donald Trump is wasteful bureaucracy, including, seriously, the IRS. I'm not making this up. And on climate, the American government has been slinging funds around in vast quantities with remarkably little accountability. For instance, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund alone belched out around $27 billion. And one senior bureaucrat actually boasted in the final days of the Biden administration about how the EPA was tossing gold bars off the Titanic to its friends out there in the parastatal sector. You'd think that attitude would actually appall people who are convinced that there's a climate crisis and are determined to do something practical about it, not to mention those convinced there's a fiscal crisis. But instead, in one of the weirdest acts of political self-immolation in a long and colorful history of same around the world, leftists, including climate alarmists, really seem to think that hoisting the red tape flag is the ticket back to intellectual and political credibility. Do they really think the average American voter will be thrilled that, quote, new documents reveal the extent of the Biden administration's eco-grief workshops, in which U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employees were encouraged to channel feelings of ecological anxiety into life-saving changes for the planet, end quote? Eco-grief? Good grief. And then there's the New York Times throwing a fit that, quote, the Trump administration plans to all but eliminate the office that oversees America's recovery from the largest disasters, raising questions about how the United States will rebuild from hurricanes, wildfires, and other calamities made worse by climate change, end quote. Are we talking about FEMA here? NOAA? The EPA? Maybe the National Guard? No, this vital agency that you never heard of is the Office of Community Planning and Development, which Francis Scott Key unaccountably left out of the Star-Spangled Banner and Lincoln forgot to stress at Gettysburg, but which surely is the very acme of American idealism, Yankee know-how, and constitutional liberty. Right, guys? Never mind rebuilding through private enterprise and neighbors helping neighbors. Instead, evidently, it hinges on not cutting this tentacle of the Department of Housing and Urban Development from 936 staff to 150 within the Beltway, where it, quote, is headed by an assistant secretary who oversees the following: Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Community Planning and Development, Principal Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Community Planning and Development, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Development, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Needs, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs, Director, Office of Field Management, Director, Office of Policy Development and Coordination, Director, Office of Technical Assistance and Management, Director, Office of Rural Housing and Economic Development, Director, Office of HIV/AIDS Housing, Director, Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, Director, Office of Affordable Housing Programs, Director, Office of Block Grant Assistance, Director, Office of Environment and Energy. Oh, say, can you see? Can you see the EPA parking some $2 billion in grants with Power Forward Communities, a fledgling outfit with just $100 in revenue in its first 3 months that happens by random coincidence to be the brainchild of chronic Democratic campaigner and activist Stacey Abrams? And now, a word from our sponsor, which as always is you. Because at the Climate Discussion Nexus, we don't get lavish government money. We're not backed by huge foundations. We're crowdfunded. We're dependent on your one-time or monthly contributions, including now the thanks button on YouTube, if that's where you're watching us, to put out the newsletter, to make these videos, and to keep pushing back against climate alarmist idiocy. I actually think the battle is going quite well, but it's not won yet, so please help us push on to the finish line. An outfit called the Liberal Patriot recently posed one simple question for Democrats about all this stuff, namely, quote, what would the working class say, end quote? Which almost certainly isn't, give me bureaucracy or give me death. Instead, in the disorganized flight 7 ways from net zero toward actual prosperity and security around the world, including in Canada, even politicians in our province of Quebec, who long sneered about the lack of something they called social license for energy projects that might benefit the country as a whole, are suddenly sounding different about pipelines now that President Trump has suggested that the United States doesn't need the energy that they didn't want to sell them. Ah, and you see those trees outside the window? If you can see anything for the snow? Well, they're not really there. Quote, trees are losing the battle against climate change, end quote. And that massive global greening over 40 years never happened, any more than the brutal winter chill still clutching most of North America as, quote, cold Canadian air has flooded into Mexico, end quote, and climate-obsessed cabinet ministers canceled dull photo ops due to inclement weather. Or they relocate them to sunnier climes. For instance, a sophomoric post, quote, big news, Team Canada is taking on Australia. Canada, heart Australia. We're bringing our biggest ever trade mission to Australia with 220 plus delegates from across all 10 provinces, end quote. Coincidentally in the dead of winter in Canada and summer in Australia. And, quote, the Honourable Mary Ng, Minister of Export Promotion, International Trade and Economic Development, end quote, a ludicrous post and a champion plane crammer, recently also boasted of blasting off to Jakarta in mid-Canadian winter, quote, to lead Canada's largest ever Team Canada trade mission to Indonesia and the Philippines, end quote. And there's more where that expense account high living came from, as, quote, this was Canada's 5th Team Canada trade mission, traveling to its 7th Indo-Pacific market since 2023, end quote. And trailing carbon the whole way. Oh, and speaking of Australia, its banks are now also fleeing Mark Carney's collapsing net zero banking alliance, with Macquarie being the first to go but not, we confidently predict, the last. Meanwhile, another dispatch from Fantasyland. Barron's claims, quote, move over Florida. Retirees are making new plans as climate change raises costs, end quote. As for actual mobility data within the United States, well, who cares about that junk? Also, while we at CDN remain resolutely opposed to geoengineering paranoia, as we do to all conspiracy theories, as we said last week, we do again note, as we said last week, that climate alarmists are working hard to make paranoia about geoengineering seem reasonable. For instance, the Washington Post chortles about, quote, how an antacid for the ocean could cool the earth, end quote. Pop, pop, fizz, fizz, oh, what a relief it's not. As if humans really have the power and wisdom to turn the oceans into something different and better. Humans who in many cases could not unclog a sink without professional assistance. And worse, the Post enthuses that, quote, at least a couple of startups, end quote, are already doing pilot projects without permission or supervision. One of them, quote, running a small site in Washington state that can remove up to 100 carbon metric tons per year and committed in October to remove 350,000 metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere over the next decade for Microsoft, end quote. If an oil company were trying to make the ocean absorb less carbon, do you suppose they'd say, it's a free country, go for it? But if Microsoft decides to do a system update on the Pacific, or reboot the air, what could go wrong? Extra points if you burst out, quote, the system might freeze, end quote. And another thing, one of the oddities of climate alarmism is that despite the mantra of follow the science, most of its adherents know little of climate science, including the physics behind alternative energy or lack of same. But they also seem to know very little about economics, and to be unpleasantly surprised when it, or physics, shakes their gory locks at them. For instance, Canadian columnist Kelly McParlin just wrote that, quote, the great electrification crusade is getting complicated. The first emissions-free day has yet to dawn, but the costs and contradictions of getting there are starting to accumulate, end quote. Starting to. Well, he goes on, quote, the end result of electrification is that demand for electricity goes up, end quote. Gosh, does it? And when it does, quote, competition for an essential product has a way of causing friction, end quote. Gosh, does it? And how do alarmists and enthusiasts take so long to get to such an elementary starting point? In the newsletter, we also note that for years natural gas, mostly methane, has been a big-time climate alarmist villain. Some scary multiple of the potency of CO2, a, quote, super potent greenhouse gas, end quote, worse than coal, seeping disaster on every side. It must be found and stopped in stoves, furnaces, industrial processes, and landfills, though not hydrodams. To hear zealots tell it, the stuff kills us dead any number of ways, from heat domes to leukemia. Until suddenly it's our best friend, as in Massachusetts, where the governor suddenly wants it cheap and plentiful and carbon pricing be hanged. The same carbon pricing that she long advocated and advocates there and elsewhere praise, because winter came. Oops. And apropos of that kind of contradiction, for years we at CDN have been warning that climate alarmism is impaling itself on the horns of a dilemma. One horn is the inability to deliver the climate catastrophe necessary to justify their distortions of science and their disastrous policy ventures. And the other is the inability to deliver that famous green energy transition. And we said that both these problems were going from being clouds no bigger than a man's hand to crossfire hurricanes as the once distant deadlines rushed toward us. So here we're actually pleased to note that in a departure from the 10 patronizing ways to win climate debates with those ignorant fools genre, Climate Cosmos offers a brief summary of why are we still waiting for a green energy revolution that never arrives, end quote. It's just one article, and it skims the surface. But it does so with considerable resolve and covers a surprising amount of ground, from the ugly footprint of EVs, to difficulties transforming the grid, to failures to invest in nuclear, to third world poverty, to the weakness of batteries. Oh, and then they complain about capitalism, but nobody's perfect. So, anyone thinking that the green energy transition is blossoming all around us might at least do a quick check. And speaking of quick checks, last week we showed you that death and destruction from floods, drought, earthquakes, and all manner of natural horrors were plummeting. So this week, we thought, to be balanced, that we'd show you something that's actually getting worse, sort of, which is US wildfire activity. And these numbers are courtesy of the National Interagency Fire Center website, where the data are shown, though they're not conveniently graphed. But if they were, then the area burned would look like this. And as you can see, it's going up. Sort of. It went up from 1983 to around 2005. But after that, it bounced around and didn't trend up further, and the number of fires has actually been decreasing. Now, if you want to take a longer perspective, and we're always into history here at CDN, to get back prior to 1983, you have to go into the Internet Archive, because the Interagency Fire Center has taken down all the pre-1983 fire numbers. They say it's because they were measured so differently that they're not comparable. And we say, bosh. For one thing, hurricane data were collected very differently back when, but since the change shows a slight increase in major storms, alarmists are perfectly happy to compare those numbers. And for another, if anything, fires were undercounted in the past, which means that the decrease is even bigger than the numbers indicate. So, they try to stop you from looking, but as noted, we were determined to look it up anyway. And while we're blazing away here, forest fire scientists use the concept of a fire deficit to describe a situation in which the number of fires actually observed is lower than history suggests that nature would normally have arranged. And of course, with all the fiery rhetoric about wildfires increasing due to climate heating, you'd expect that what we have recently is the opposite of that fire deficit, namely, yes, a fire surplus. But instead, according to a new study, since 1984, there have only been about 25% as many North American fires as you'd expect based on records from 1600 to 1880. And even our supposedly record-setting years are, by comparison with that past, remarkably calm. And now for an actual surplus. Chrysanthemum morifolium ramat, or mums, are a fall flower in Canada, except for the bit where in the spring we clear the remains out of those baskets on the back deck. But the CO2science.org archive says that from 1983 to 1989, 14 experiments showed that an extra 600 parts per million of CO2 in the air resulted in a 33% growth increase for mums, and one experiment showed that 900 parts per million boosted it by 59%. So, if they are bigger and healthier come September, you can thank CO2. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and red tape makes me see red.